Hi, good afternoon. I think we'll start. Thank you all for coming to hear Lisa Lipinski talk about the man in the bowler hat. I'm Cheryl Hartup, the curator of academic programs in Latin American and Caribbean art. And it's just such an honor to have my dear friend and colleague, Lisa Lipinski, here. We met the first weekend of graduate school at University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Tina. Can you hear me? I need to talk louder. Okay. So that was 24 years ago, and she was writing and thinking about Magritte back then. So it's just so exciting to have her book that just came out featured in this talk. So she'll be speaking about Magritte, his paintings of women, reading some passages from her book, René Magritte and the Art of Thinking, which was published just a few months ago, and also talking about our spectacular masterworks on loan painting, La Magie Noire, up in our European art gallery. So I hope you all have seen it. If not, go after the talk and spend some time in front of it. So her next publication will focus on women, pictorialist photographers, and it grows out of her research on Sally Mann, who's an artist also represented, or an artist represented in the Schnitzer Museum of Art's collection. Lisa Lipinski is assistant professor of art history at the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design at George Washington University. She earned her doctorate from University of Texas at Austin in art history in 2000. She teaches courses on history of photography, theory and history of graphic design, history of exhibitions, the body in modern and contemporary art, seminars on Dada, Surrealism, and the art of the 21st century. Her courses regularly include field trips to local art museums and memorials, and she's a licensed DC tour guide. Lisa teaches courses on art at the State Department for diplomats to foster cultural understanding. I love that new development in your profession and career. She's worked in curatorial departments at the San Francisco Museum of Art, the Phillips Collection, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And her essays have appeared in museum catalogs on Pierre Bonnard, and I had the pleasure of working with her on 2 publications for the Museo de Arte de Ponce in Puerto Rico. One was on 19th century American and French painting, and another on Spanish and Flemish paintings in the collection of the Museo Nacional del Prado. So Lisa will take questions at the end of her talk. And also want to mention that tomorrow, same time, but upstairs in the Schnitzer gallery, we have a gallery talk by the artist Naime Naima and her paintings of extinct and endangered animals. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Lipinski.
Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. So I'd like to thank Cheryl Hartup for inviting me to speak about Magritte, and the staff who assisted with the travel arrangements, and Paul Nordquist for assisting with the tech, and the University of Oregon and the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, and finally the collector who shared the painting, which I had never seen before, and I've been studying Magritte for like 30 years. It was in private collections, so it's really quite an honor and a treat that you can see this painting, which I deem excellent, and I'm an expert, so I should know. I also want to acknowledge George Washington University, which supported the research and writing of this publication, because there's a cost involved in doing research and publishing art books. And I can get you a discount if you'd like to buy it. And we would make sure it's in the library here. So in René Magritte and the Art of Thinking, I made the argument that Magritte's art was conceptual, about thought and thinking, rather than being purely surrealist. i.e. tapping the unconscious or even dream imagery, which is how he is usually understood. I placed his work in the longer art historical tradition of meta-painting, that is, art which is about art itself. The tradition begins with Dutch painting and the creation of painting as tableau rather than mural or miniature. Through paintings of ordinary objects rendered with illusion, Magritte probed the limits of our perceptions, what we see and cannot see, the nature of representation as a philosophical system for representing ideas. And I thought I would give you a little bit of biography to, if for your interest and edification. So there's a picture of René and his wife Georgette, who was the model for the painting that is on view today. So Magritte was born in 1898 in a province in Belgium. He studied art at the Royal Academy of Art, but he never finished his studies. He supported himself through commercial art, designing advertisements and sheet music covers. He married Georgette when they were quite young, his model, muse, and wife. And there's a picture of young lovers, and there's a picture in the 60s. They're still together with their dog, Lulu. They always had Pomeranians, usually black, and they always had the name Lulu. So before Magritte became a surrealist, he was painting in different styles, experimenting with modernism. And in this work, we see, called Man at the Window, 1920, he's experimenting with cubism. But he also has noticed there's a painting in the painting, there's a window, right? So this is one aspect of meta painting that you often see: curtains, windows, frames, and doorways. So, and this was the revelation. So he's painting like this, experimenting with style, which is what all the modernists were doing. He was well versed in the early types of avant-garde. But a friend showed him a black and white reproduction because he couldn't at that point reproduce works in color. And he saw this painting by Giorgio de Chirico, The Song of Love, and it changed him. He decided what he painted was more important than how. So he saw this as an evocative, haunting juxtaposition of odd elements in a dreamlike architectural space. The work had a great influence on Magritte's artistic approach. For the next few years, he developed a singular style that comprised carefully rendered everyday objects, often placed in enigmatic juxtapositions, quite like this. And Giorgio de Chirico in art history is classified as a metaphysical painter. In 1926, Magritte was under contract to Galeries Le Centaure in Brussels, so he could devote himself to painting. After he discovered The Song of Love in 1922, he went on quickly to start to experiment. He did first in collage, The Lost Jockey, and he saw this as kind of a representation of himself, the lost jockey wandering. Where's my pointer? Here we go. So it's a collage. He cut out sheet music and in these forms of the bilboquet, which is an evocative kind of symbol, that motif that he used throughout his career. Notice the curtains framing the whole scene, and other surrealists were also experimenting. The Dadaists and the Surrealists experimented with collage. He considered this his first surrealist painting. So this was a work that appeared in his first solo show in 1927, just before he moved to Paris with his wife. And I want to read, this figures prominently in my book, The Threatened Assassin. L'assassin menacé, the menaced assassin, was one of Magritte's largest and most complex paintings to date. Painted for a solo exhibition at Galeries Le Centaure in April 1927, it presents the scene of a lurid crime of passion in the most calm and detached manner. The colors are bright and naturalistic, with no flourishes of bravura brushwork detracting from the evidence of a murder. A bright red spot of paint in the center of the canvas, right there, in the center of the canvas. In a starkly furnished room, a nude female corpse lies on a daybed. The bed is yet another recurrent motif in Magritte's work. With one leg dangling over the side, blood flows from her mouth, and the flimsy cloth draped over her neck does not disguise the fact that her head appears to be severed from her body. A well-dressed young man, presumably the murderer, faces away from his victim, his attention and gaze absorbed by the music issuing from a gramophone on a table. Though inaudible to us, we can imagine it. With one hand in his pocket and the other resting on the table, the assassin is oblivious to the threat of the two armed men in bowler hats who wait outside the room, or the presence of three others who peer in from the outdoors over a wrought iron grill. The painting presents a series of spaces drawn in one-point perspective with receding lines meeting at the victim's head. The space in front of the room is occupied implicitly by the viewer, as well as the two would-be assailants who wield a club and the length of netting. Both stare into space, their impassive faces betraying no emotion. They do not appear ready to spring into action, nor do they seem very menacing. With these unlikely weapons, unlike the hooded captors in the film still from Louis Feuillard's 1913 film Fantomas, which scholars believe inspired the painting. In the stills, two masked criminals wait outside an open door through which we see a character named Monsieur Thomery and a woman whose face is obscured by a veil. In the film, it is the thugs who kill the victim. Here, Magritte has changed their roles. No longer as assassins, they represent law and order. The Surrealists were drawn to stories of violent crime and the sensationalism of true crime stories, and Magritte himself wrote short scripts for detective films. It is undisputed that the painting had a literary source. Images peintes, painted images, a text composed in 1927 by Paul Nouget, probably with input from Magritte. And Paul Nouget was one of the Belgian surrealists with whom Magritte associated. So here's the text that Paul Nouget wrote. In this room, amidst a minimal litter of underclothing, there is an almost naked woman, a corpse of rare perversity. Were it not for this dead woman, nothing could disturb so peaceful an interior. Everything in it is neat and tranquil. The spotless floor, the uncluttered table, a tall pedestal table of dark wood, and with the scarf draped softly over the neck, over the shoulder, over the astonishing wound, it would require a certain effort to imagine a severed head. So the painting is intriguing because it seems to show everything and nothing. Every figure and object is in plain sight, leading me to say that the space is filled with the gaze or visibility. Meanwhile, none of the figures seem to be looking in the right direction or exchanging looks with anyone else, which suggests that the murderer is seen only by the spectator of the picture. What is vividly on display here is the blind spot at the center of our field of vision, and this is the central mystery of which Magritte often wrote. There is seeing or vision, and there is perception, and they are not, according to Jacques Lacan, the same. Lacan notes that the visual field encompasses something that cannot be seen or grasped within the visual. If we held up a mirror to the, and I'm skipping some sections here, but if we held up a mirror to the Magritte painting, in effect recreating Brunelleschi's famous experiment, which demonstrated perspective, the central figure in the back of the room, whose eyes literally occupy the vanishing point of the picture, could see the whole scene, including the two thugs outside the room, enabling the invisible to become visible in the painting. Perspective promises to reveal something, namely the meaning of the crime scene. For the murder has already been solved, so there is hardly any suspense. Magritte has turned the promise of perspective as a revelation of truth inside out by showing us everything and withholding meaning. All three men in the foreground are depicted with their overcoat or jacket buttoned on the wrong side for menswear, which Anne Umland reads as a subtle detail that suggests the scene might be considered a mirror image, contributing to its phantasmagoric or imaginary character. Which brings me to the women. And we were looking at a woman in the last painting. So in thinking about the context for the Black Magic, the painting on display, I wanted to read from this part. And it was this painting that I was always intrigued by in my studies, because it's the unusual thing of having her flesh turn into wood or fur. Is she an animal? What was happening? So when he painted this work, he was now living in Paris. He had just moved there. And he and Georgette lived in Paris from the fall of 1927 to 1930, about 2.5 years. And it was his most productive period of his career, painting several hundred paintings. So he was almost painting a painting a day, working quickly. He was working out his style, working out his imagery. And he wrote to Nugent. They were writing letters back and forth to each other, and he was excited about this painting in particular. So I'm reading from a letter to Nugent. Magritte writes, "I think I have made a really striking discovery in painting. Up to now, I have used composite objects, or else the position of an object was sometimes enough to make it mysterious. But as a result of the experiments I've made here, I found a new potential in things, their ability to become gradually something else, an object merging into an object other than itself. For instance, the sky in certain places allows wood to show through. This seems to me to be something quite different from composite objects, since there is no break between the two substances and no limit. This was an important discovery, and one Magritte would draw on for many years to come, that illusionism could be used to depict the virtual plane of potential in things, that is, becoming rather than being." And he goes on to say, "By this means, I produce pictures in which the eye must think," and that's in quotations, "think in a completely different way from the usual one. Things are tangible, and yet a few planks of solid wood become imperceptibly transparent in certain places, or else a naked woman has parts which also change into a different substance." Now, it's likely he adopted the pose from an erotic postcard. So he would often be inspired by reproductions from popular culture, from postcards, from newspapers and magazines, but I don't find her the least bit sexy. Despite the pose and the strange distribution of this, there's flesh, there's the wood, and also look at her gaze. She's not making eye contact, she's kind of a blank stare, she's rather bulky, heavy, and probably Georgette posed for it, but he's clearly disguised. It's not Georgette anymore. But he's playing with illusionism and turning it to these other ends for showing the virtual and showing this idea of becoming. And as he experiments, this one is also illustrated in the book, Les Jours Gigantesques, The Titanic Days. Magritte's paintings manifest the surreal or surreality, that is, the resolution of the dream and waking state, in order to invoke a state that he called mystery. Paul Gustav van Hecke, a Belgian writer, art dealer, and promoter, addresses the issue of Magritte's use of an apparently rational and detached style to prompt the viewer to experience the emotional unease of an encounter with the mysterious. And Van Hecke writes, "In speaking of the painting of Magritte, only the direct language of cold reason is appropriate. The emotion is within. Cool or warm, take your choice. However, the necessity to explain must not be allowed to stifle the need to feel." In Magritte's hands, painting could be used to shock, shatter, and provoke experience, to transform life. Thus, we have come far from the idea and image of painting as a window. So he's turning illusionism to other purposes. When he painted this work, by this time, he and Georgette were back in Brussels, where he lived for the rest of his life. With the exception of short trips, he and Georgette never left Brussels. And this work, which is in the Menil Collection, I thought of it in terms of the technique of painting that maybe you've heard of called trompe-l'œil, tricking the eye. And one of the theorists, Louis Marin, talks about trompe-l'œil as a kind of simulacrum, which suppresses the distance between model and copy. The effect is, quote, not one of contemplation and theory, a return to the serene real, hence the reality effect of all representation, but of surreality, an impure blend of anguish and shock, the effect of presence, end quote. And I think that's what he's going here for, is the effect of presence, but he's undercutting that by literally cutting up the canvas and putting it in multiple frames. Another work created in connection with the solo exhibition in Paris depicts a full-length nude spread over 5 framed canvases, the sections aligned on a vertical glass support. And here you can see, so that's how it is displayed at the Menil. It's on a plexiglass clear, and it's set forward from the wall, which I think is intentional, quite intentional. So it's not meant to be seen flush on the wall. Although the figure is literally cut up, we are tempted to reach out and to touch her. The artist called this and other related works his toile découpée, cut-out canvases. In a letter to Nugget, Magritte included a sketch of the nude and described the process of creating these works. He says, I have done a few objects, one of which is a naked woman and the others a landscape and sky. The woman is represented life-size, and you can see that in the photograph. Each of these images is presented thus. Of the woman, I show only parts of the body, but situated where they should be. Each of these small pictures is framed and fixed on a pane of glass with a sky or a landscape. I perform the same operation. It may be observed with this type of picture, it becomes impossible to cut them up without destroying them completely. It seems to me that they gain from being subjected to such a process. Like a jigsaw puzzle pulled apart, the painting asserts itself as much as a sculptural object as a painting. Missing segments can be inferred, but they are not necessary for the image to work as a whole. Despite the gaps, the painting directs the gaze downward in a kind of cinematic way. And I think if you imagine you're looking, because the perspective changes subtly on whichever part of the body you're looking at. The 2 lower segments of the figure's body are seen from a slightly different perspective than the head and torso, so that we see her knees and feet as though we were standing beside her looking down. Magritte posed for a photograph with his arm around the eternally obvious, as if the figure had come to life. The model is his wife, who returns his and the viewer's gaze, her head turned slightly, a seductive half-smile on her lips. Sensually positioned close to the picture plane, the body is cropped to draw particular attention to its erogenous zone. The frames touch the nipple on the figure's right breast in one panel and the edge of her pubic hair in another. So he's thinking about the cutting up, and so he was doing shaped canvases ahead of all of the contemporary artists who experimented with this, like Frank Stella, for example. So this he called simply representation. In representation, Magritte creates a simulacrum of the nude, which is at once shocking and productive of the surreal effect of presence through the elimination of any ground and the placement of the paint on the surface to resemble flesh and bones. In representation, Magritte employs a trompe-l'oeil to interrogate representation and to foreground the objecthood of the work of art. Instead of looking into the illusory depths of a picture plane, pictorial space to see what is depicted there, the viewer disconcertingly sees a close-up female body framed. The canvas was cut down and with the attention paid to the soft contours of the waist, hips, and thighs. By defining the contours of the frame through the body, the painting asserts itself as a figure detached from the background. It depends on the viewer's perception of its haptic qualities, the muscle and soft tissue, the bones and hip structure. And I think as we look at it, your tendency, you follow that nice curve of the frame. The muscles and tissues, the bones and hip structure appear to project into our space, activating our sense of touch as our eye travels over the topography of the body. While the absence of pubic hair, which Magritte included in other nudes, lends a certain decorum and representation, the curves of the frame and the play of shadows on the body emphasize its sexuality. The effect of trompe-l'oeil is disconcerting, since the technique is usually reserved for still life objects, not a naked human body. The frame symbolizes and strengthens the boundaries of the body, putting it at a distance from the real, which makes it aesthetically enjoyable. And so originally the painting was this. So there was a ground, there was a background, and this is a photograph posed. Irene Amoir was a poet and part of the Belgian circle of surrealists. So in a photograph of Irene Amoir, a Belgian novelist and poet and leading female member of the Belgian surrealist movement, shows the original state of the work before it was cut down and framed. Standing in slight contrapposto, she has superimposed the painted torso over her body. The photograph is cropped at the top, so we do not see anything of Amoir above the painting, only her shapely legs below it, which playfully reinforces the truncation of the provocative image. With the radical move of shaping the canvas, Magritte created a stunning and startling object that plays in the gap between representation and abstraction. Magritte was pleased with the outcome, writing to André Breton, the surrealist poet, "I am preparing some canvases for your intended exhibition of my work. I have done the frame section of a female body that I spoke to you about in Paris. It constitutes a rather surprising object, I think." The mystery evoked in representation is that of sexual desire, objectified in the female body, that is, made into an object without giving away all of its secrets. It is often said that Magritte was obsessed with the hidden, with concealment, often covering the heads of his figures or putting things in shadows. As Jacques Lacan notes, fundamentum has more than one meaning. In the Kabbalah, it designates one of the modes of divine manifestation, which in this register is strictly identified with the pudendum. In representation, we have the, quote, truth of painting, that it conceals as much as it reveals, and that the problem of what is underneath is displaced and transformed into a new kind of layer. Significantly, this is the only shaped canvas, excluding the shaped canvases within paintings, in Magritte's oeuvre, which suggests that with this work he concluded his research on how to represent a single object. In the 1930s, he frequently painted female torsos as human flesh or classical statuary, but none of these works is quite so powerful, sensuous, and surreal as this simple image, which intimates presence. By suppressing the distance between model and copy, the trompe-l'oeil and the simulacrum suspends the referential relationship so that the viewer may be astonished and shocked by seeing a painting as a kind of uncanny body double. Did you know this was a Magritte? Would you have known? Kind of shocking, right? So he changed his style. His signature style of illusionism was practiced up until the war, and in the Second World War. And in The Harvest from 1943, we see his appropriation of a style practiced by the Impressionists, and specifically Renoir, which I think is appropriate considering that you have the masterwork on display upstairs. If you go and look, there's a Renoir painting right across the gallery. I don't know if the curators knew about this connection, but it is an important one. So in 1943, Magritte abruptly changed his style. He adopted the palette and painterly technique of the Impressionists, specifically Renoir. In treatises and letters, he offered a theory of this newfound style, which he called Surrealism in full sunlight. In a letter to Paul Bury, he wrote, "Since the beginning of this war, I have had a strong desire to achieve a new poetic effectiveness, which would bring us both charm and pleasure. I leave it to others the business of causing anxiety and terror and mixing everything up as before." And what he's referring to are the surrealists, who are all about shaking up the rational and showing you something dark and disturbing. So he breaks with the style, and this is painting in the Fine Arts Museum of Belgium. There was a recent exhibition last year at SF MoMA looking at his Impressionist and some of the Vache paintings to show us a different side of Magritte that's not usually seen. Because for many years, people did not consider these paintings, or they were something put in storage and not seen. So how do I think? So when I was approaching and writing this book, I looked at these works again, and they really fit into the argument that I was making about his being painter of thought and a meta painter and reflecting on what painting is. So what I wrote about The Harvest is this might be a parody of Impressionism, except that Magritte was quite serious. 2 years earlier, he had written to Paul Éluard that he wanted to create, quote, pictures in which the bright side of life would be the area to be exploited. By this, I mean the whole traditional range of charming things, women, flowers, birds, trees, end quote. He sought to charm rather than disturb, as he had with the former Surrealist works. To do so, he selected typically delightful subjects and inserted a key difference. By appropriating the outmoded technique of Impressionism, he found a new use for another artist's signature style. Instead of charming through conventional and naturalistic means, as Renoir did, Magritte creates a figure both brassy and pensive. Everything lies on the surface of the harvest. The figure is nestled in a riotous mass of arbitrary saturated colors, orange, green, yellow, and blue, applied to the canvas in unblended, choppy strokes. The material of painting, pigment and brushwork, takes on a thickness and rises to the surface, thereby fitting into the second category of art as thought defined by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in What is Philosophy? Quote, it is no longer sensation that is realized in the material, but the material that passes into sensation. In contrast to the transparency found in his usual surrealist works, Magritte draws attention to the surface and allows the underneath of painting to show. The sensation of light and pleasures occurs independently of depth and perspective, independently of shadows, and even of chromatic order of color, the arbitrary colorist. Susie Gablick suggests that Magritte's Renoiresque painting style and the Vache works call the medium itself into question. In previous works, his self-reflexive painting involved the parerga of frames, doors, and windows, while the meta painting now reflects on the idea of style and the expectation of stylistic consistency across a body of work. It would seem that in choosing not to resemble himself, Magritte contests his artistic identity as a surrealist and as an image maker and claims a different purpose for painting, offering a kind of shock, but one that is consistent with his earlier surrealist work. While it may superficially evoke something of late Renoir, the harlequin-like figure is humorous and mysterious in Magritte's singular way. And it was probably, again, Georgette who posed for the work. And this brings me to the masterwork, Black Magic. And since I did not write about this, it's in the catalog Raisonné in black and white, so this is the first time I've seen the painting and seen the brilliant color. So the Renoir period lasted about 2 years during the war, and all of his friends and his wife said, go back to your old style. We don't like this new style. It's not that interesting. It's not very good painting, and it doesn't sell, because those works did not sell. Now they do, but of course, anything by Magritte. So by 1946, he goes back to his old style of painting, the illusionism. But I see this work, if you think about the discovery, the woman with the wood going as part of her skin, I think we see the same kind of operation in place with the blue of her upper torso. And you see the blending here of the flesh tone of the lower section. And I really enjoyed the label. I thought it was a wonderful written label. And I want to bring in, so right about the same time in the catalog Raisonné, these works are on opposite pages. And I think I prefer this work. I think it's more beautiful, more resolved, and so he's removed the curtain, which is a traditional motif that he always had things framed. Remember the lost jockey? He's removed the curtains, and here he's put the drape subtly on this rock. He keeps the same pose, but now we have that change in color, and you can see his skills as a painter. And one thing I think, I was drawn to Magritte because he's a conceptual artist, but he was an excellent painter. His skills were at their height in the 40s. He comes back to his signature style of illusionism and works too with color amazingly, because if you look at the water, he's carried over this mauve pink, and even in the brushwork here. And so he lavishes attention on water, clouds, the rock, the figure. And as I was looking and thinking about it in preparation for this talk, I thought, he's not an artist who works like I'm making a symbol, but I think in this painting he makes an exception because he has a dove perched on her shoulder. And if you look at the date, 1946, the war is over, Belgium had been occupied, and he had been censored to the extent that he didn't want to show the painting of the pipe that said, this is not a pipe. He said, they'll lock me up, think I'm crazy. So I see it as a symbol of peace. And also, it works with the painting itself, because if you think about the upper torso, notice how the blending, and it's not a line, that would be too obvious, right? It's a subtle shift in color that happens right at her waist and right at that horizon. So the upper part of her body is the sky, representing the heavens, and the lower part is the earth, and he puts the dove there on her shoulder, and it's just beautiful. This is Georgette posed for this. That was one of 8 versions that he did. So Magritte often repainted work, sometimes part of it was he would sell more, and once he had his iconic motifs, he often repeated. So in the final chapter of the book, I turn to self-portraits, because that's really where you see the artist meditation, a tradition that started well before Magritte, but that's where you can see the artist meditating on his or her own practice. And I want to conclude with it, looking at one of the paintings of the self-portrait and a photograph. So this is from 1928. It's one of those works he painted while in Paris, called Attempting the Impossible. Magritte shows himself at work creating a woman, not on a depicted canvas, but within the illusory space he himself occupies. The artist holds paintbrushes and a palette in his left hand and uses his right hand at the center of the composition to conjure the figure out of and into thin air. Metaphorically, the image describes an artist starting with a dematerialized idea and ultimately creating something from nothing using real materials. In painting the act of painting, Magritte engages with a traditional subject in canonical Western art that was a major preoccupation in the 17th century. In Vermeer's The Art of Painting, we see the back of the painter as he paints the model who stands before him. As viewers, we are positioned at the threshold, and here I'm talking about the Vermeer, we're positioned at the threshold of the room in front of a tapestry curtain that has been drawn back, as if we were intruders, being given a glimpse into the artist's world and process. Magritte modernizes the tradition, dispensing with the model and the canvas propped on an easel. He inserts us into the space of the scene, looking at the artist painting the figure, both occupying the same plane and both casting shadows. We witness the birth of the image as it materializes under the painter's brush and gaze. He is not representing the nude. He is in the process of giving her reality in his own space. Rather than diminishing the magical effect of painting, the deconstruction invites us to watch and wonder. The figure of the artist, the maker, comes to life as well under the steady gaze of the companion figure he makes. Magritte painted the work in his Paris apartment, which served as his studio. A photograph of the work in progress with the artist looking toward the canvas and away from the camera was published in Variété on January 15th, 1929. The figures were completed first. Oh, I'm talking about a painting of that. There was a photograph taken of him painting this painting. But I continue here. So in attempting the impossible, all of the nude's figure's body has been completed except for her left arm. She stands in contrapposto, the weight shifted to her right leg, her left knee slightly bent. Her right arm hangs loosely by her side. The artist is turned sideways to the picture plane, putting his face in profile. At the same time that the painter touches the figure with his brush, he is touched by her. The arm he is painting appears to be incipiently reaching for him. By addressing the theme of the artist and model, here, and it's as if she is reaching out. We have to imagine that. At the same moment, he is touched by her. The arm he is painting appears to be incipiently reaching for him. By addressing the theme of the artist and model, Magritte taps into the myth of Pygmalion from Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which the sculptor Pygmalion falls passionately in love with the marble statue he carves, which Aphrodite then brings to life. In this 1928 photograph, Magritte and his wife Georgette play on this reference, striking the poses shown in the painting, which hung in their apartment in Paris. Wearing a swimsuit, Georgette stands in contrapposto with her left arm on her hip, receding into the shadows as she gazes at Magritte, dressed more casually than in the painting, whose brush touches her upper arm. Magritte and Georgette together perform the act of painting, lending agency to the model as well as to the artist. In the painting, by omitting the easel and canvas typically featured in painters' self-portraits, Magritte has omitted the image within an image and pulled the focus back like a cinematographer. The artist is simultaneously inside and outside the picture, enacting the impossible. Pictorial ambiguities multiply when the painting is considered in the tradition of depicting the artist at work as a scene of production, which most of the 17th century self-portraits aspired to. Here, the artist is dressed as a bourgeois gentleman at work on his creation, bearing only a tenuous resemblance to Magritte himself, even as the painting asserts his presence as author. The artist in Magritte's painting performs a triple function. He is beholder, looking at the woman, the object of observation, we are looking at him, and the creator who signs the canvas. By escaping the traditional frontal view of the artist, Magritte makes a case for the superior powers of the artist in general, rather than for himself in particular. And I conclude with this photograph, which the one on the right is in the Art Institute of Chicago, and I discovered this in my research. The one on the left is more familiar. Marcel Brotars is a Belgian contemporary artist. He was a poet, became a visual artist, conceptual artist, and he was much inspired by Magritte and worked in that tradition, turning some of Magritte's ideas into more conceptual art. So in 1967, Brotars' wife, Maria Gillison, took a photograph of Magritte handing the bowler hat to Brotars. Standing together in Magritte's garden, they laugh as they both clasp the hat. In a remarkable photograph of 1967, Magritte, again wearing his signature hat, posed for Brotars himself. And incidentally, he posed with the bowler hat. It's not the type of hat he typically wore. And he smoked cigarettes, not a pipe. The photograph was taken sometime between the completion of the work in front of the painter. So there are two paintings. This one is finished. This one is on another easel behind him, unfinished. So the work in front is called The End of the World. And in that of the canvas behind him, in which he sketched the outline for another work, Evening Falls. This photograph of Magritte is unique. There's no manipulation of the negative, and the artist is not engaged in the act of painting. Instead, he stands between a finished and an unfinished painting. Brotars and Magritte collaborated on this image, two conceptual artists working together to create a subtle and mysterious image of the artist literally in the middle of his work. The painting in front of Magritte combines the theme of the series L'Empire des Lumières, the Empire of Light, in which an illuminated sky appears above a neighborhood at night, and that of La Rencontre du Plaisir, Towards Pleasure, 1950, which shows the man in a bowler hat posed in a dark landscape under a blue sky. In the painting, the bowler-hatted man faces away from the viewer, while in the photograph, the face of the bowler-hatted artist is illuminated by the match he has just struck to light a cigarette. In the photograph, Magritte's head and hand are the only parts of his body visible. The flame creates a resonant metaphor for the artist at work. The photograph may be seen as a meditation on the act of painting, as well as photography. In interpreting this image, it is useful to consider Stoichita's concept of contextual self-projection, which he defines as any representation of the author inserted into a work with a view of asserting its authorship. In Brotars' picture, Magritte plays with the concept by taking on not only the role of artist, but that of model, the man in the bowler hat, the enigmatic figure who first appeared in the Musings of a Solitary Walker in 1926. So 1926 is the first time we saw the bowler-hatted man, and then he revives that figure in the 60s. Whereas other photographs specifically by another photographer, Dwayne Michaels, are more about Michaels himself, with Magritte as his foil or subject, the Brotars photograph reveals the essence of Magritte's philosophy, that behind every object, there is another object. Behind the real Magritte, who stands behind his work, is the simulation of a man who knew only too well the power of art to dissemble and to mythologize. Thank you. So if you want to see Magrittes in Brussels, I would recommend going to there's now a Magritte Museum, and Brussels is capitalized. He's their most famous export, probably their most famous artist. His house in Jet, his last residence, is now open as a museum. And they've collected, the Royal Museums of Fine Arts has an extensive collection of Magritte paintings, and they've set it apart from the Royal Museum so you can see Magritte in full glory. So let's have some questions. Yes?
Thank you. I was curious if you could talk about his worldview a little bit, because I look at him with his contemporaries, and there seems to be just less of a sense of nihilism and existentialism. It just seems there's more of kind of an optimism to his work, or like painting was sort of his salvation in these really dark times that he lived through. And I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
So his worldview in terms of his philosophy, or his
how painting in the context that he was painting in, and how that's reflected in the work with what was going on in the world around him.
Well, so late 20s, I mean, he associated with the Surrealists. He moved to Paris to be closer to the Surrealist movement. They were gathered in Paris. This is right after World War I. Dada kind of petered out, and André Breton was there gathering a whole circle. He subscribed to some of the Surrealist practice and philosophy, but I think significantly in Paris, he lived in the suburbs. He lived a little bit on the outskirts. And in part, people have explained that as well. He didn't want to rent an artist studio. And what I find interesting, he never had a studio. He painted either in his kitchen or his living room. So, but I think his worldview, he was always seeking to be different. So he was not in lockstep with Surrealism, tapping the unconscious. He did not do that. He might have an image that would come to him, but he always tried to be a little different and see things in an unusual way, to alter and to make you question what you take for granted. But I think that especially with the Renoir-esque period, that Surrealism in full sunlight, he wrote theories about it to sell this style, but people were skeptical. But in that case, he just decided, I was painting these dark, images like the menaced assassin, and when it's really happening, this is not going to bring people joy. Like, what is the purpose of that? So that's when he radically changed his style. And then went back to his signature style later, when by the encouragement of his friends and like, you're crazy. And that moment had passed. But I think this work, the Black Magic, and if you think of Black Magic, he's conjuring this figure. It is art, painting as magical. I think he never gave up that. So there is a sense of optimism.
Just an observation. Thank you. The painting on the left side, I see that mantle. Mm-hmm. And there's a famous Magritte where you have a locomotive coming out of the mantle.
Yes.
Yeah. He might have used that as, that mantle possibly in the painting.
Oh, he did. I mean, his house, he would it might not have been this exact mantelpiece, but he did. He painted in his house, and there's a rock, so he would use that. That rock would appear in different paintings. Sometimes the whole scene would be a figure made out of stone.
Right.
The wall, the candle, everything made out of stone. So questioning the properties, if you think rocks are hard, they could be flesh. So opening that questioning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
I thank you for the talk. I was really delighted by all the images that you showed. And as you know, as well as I do, this kind of painting, and not just Magritte, but other painters in this vein, are not exactly considered canonical in certain narratives of modernism, modern art. And the Surrealist movement, for having embraced painters like this, still remains persona non grata in certain narratives of modernism, right?
Correct. Yes.
So I was really intrigued by your proposition that to look at him, of course, from the point of view of conceptual art. So I find that quite compelling. I was wondering if you can just comment, because this is a really question about this. I'd like to really hear your feedback, because in some ways there is something about the sensibility that one would have to, one will have to accept the campiness of his aesthetic sensibility, and I think that comes through very much through the background information that you just given, in a way that he is a academy dropout. He knows all the tropes of academic painting and the skills that are involved, the trompe-l'œil, the easel, the frame, the classical figures that keep coming back, right? So these are all tropes.
Right.
And he seems to think of all of this as rather campy. And I say camp, not kitsch, because camp, there's humor. There's also a kind
There's a subversion.
Right, and the kitsch is more, a moralistic concept where you condemn, right, as something low grade and not inauthentic. But campiness, as theorized by Susan Sontag, for example, does allow room for a kind of reflexivity that is actually humoristic. It has an affective quality to it. So he does have a campy. I mean, that's why certain modernists don't like this kind of thing, right? I mean, it looks like Sunday painter. I mean, the style is very much like Rousseau-Le Douanier, the Sunday painters, who don't have studios, right? Not professional painters. And but there is something about this that is related to what you wanted to talk about, which is art's reflexivity, right? And so, weirdly enough, certain narratives of modernism uses exactly that concept to justify why we should write this kind of art out, because it's not medium specific, right? It is. I'm talking about, of course, about Greenberg,
right.
But
in the typical modernist self-reflexivity is seeing painting as flat, painting as an object, and not reference to anything visible that you would see, no illusion.
Right. Yeah.
Correct. Well, I mean, when I set out to write about Magritte, and I selected this as I was intrigued. I like Surrealism. I was intrigued by the philosophy and the theory, and I was drawn to Magritte because he's this conceptual painter. There's a philosophical system I saw there, and I wanted to write about it and use contemporary critical theory, which is how I ended up at University of Texas at Austin working with Richard Schiff, because people were not at that time as open to, first of all, looking at Magritte, and I was told by some of my professors, who shall be nameless, that why do you need to go look at Magritte's? You can understand him by looking at a reproduction. And why study that painter? Because he's not valued. He's out there, he's Belgian. He was a little sort of tangentially affiliated with the Surrealists, and he was a dream painter. So he's often linked with Dali, with other painters who are working illusionistically. Paul Delvaux was another Surrealist in Belgium, but Magritte, I think, is more famous. And now we have Charlie Herscovici is keeping, there's a Magritte Foundation, so they're still finding Magritte paintings to come onto the market. But I think you're right. So he's only recently been reevaluated. There was a exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art a few years ago called The Treachery of Images, where people looked at his work and how he influenced contemporary artists. So I think his influence was stronger on contemporary art, and it took a while to be appreciated. I'm the only American who's written a monograph on Magritte.
I mean, this is kind of the radicality of some of what you're proposing, because in a way, what I hear you saying is, why shouldn't a meta-reflection on illusionism also be part of that self-reflexivity that we consider that modernist art should be doing, right?
Right. I mean, I'm trying to disrupt the narrative of Magritte, the simplistic understanding of him, and there's been more research done. There are exhibitions happening, like the SF MoMA exhibition, which promised to show some of the Renoir paintings, which they did, but I wanted to see more of that. And he did a short-lived Vache period where he's deliberately creating bad painting, and that's a whole other aspect to explore. But thank you for that question. Yes.
Something you just said sounded like me, in that I know almost nothing. So, pardon my ignorance if this is a stupid comment or question, but 6 guys standing around a decapitated woman with no particular emotional response, and then you have the severed body in different frames, and then you have the one separate piece of the trunk. Did he use men for any of these sorts of studies of the body? I'm just kind of not, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but it just, his wife was available, yeah, right, but his psyche, and you asked about the worldview, it's like, has he been psychoanalyzed?
Ellen Handler Spitz has written about him, she's approached. So when he was 12, his mother committed suicide. She drowned in the Sambre River. And so Ellen Handler Spitz, another art historian who's examined his work in terms of that suicide as a child, he could not mourn as an adult. And so has understood his art as working through that trauma. And I didn't want, her approach is valid, but it wasn't mine. So I'm much more interested in how he's looking at the history of art and thinking about his medium of painting in his time and what others are doing. And what's, I think, telling is André Breton didn't until, so they were part of the same circle. They knew each other, supported each other, but it's not until the 40s that André Breton weighed in on what Magritte was doing. Like, they didn't really understand what he was doing. But I was not as interested in the psychological. I think I see this, as I hope my short reading came through, is he's interested in detective fiction, mystery stories. He was writing and doing his own short films. I have not seen those. I don't know if they still exist, but he was influenced by the sensational. And in that way, there are moments in his career when he intersects quite clearly with some of the other surrealists and exploring it, but it's not being about his psyche, per se.
So was originally going to ask about the relationship to Ernst, but since we want to focus on Magritte, maybe I'll save that for later. But some of what you highlighted, and this was the really, the great material experimentation that he went through. I mean, the early collage was so fascinating and not a side of Magritte that we ever see. And mounting the canvases on the plexiglass, which, you know, of course, like Dali does a similar thing a little bit later, the shaped canvas also. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how is he experimenting with medium and how is that informing the content of these paintings, thinking about collage as a technique that adds to the idea of flatness, but also the incorporation of different sorts of materials into the canvas, but also the use of photography for thinking about tentative de l'impossible. So yeah, just a little more about the experiments would be great.
Well, he worked, so with the collages in the late 20s, as other surrealists like Max Ernst were exploring collage. And he almost exclusively used music and the Girls of Gothenburg, a specific score. And I think that remains to be studied a little more. There's been not much written about his collages, so he was doing this in the 20s, then he stopped in 1930, and he picks up the collages later in his life. So it's interesting as what comes back, circles back in terms of chronology, because he paints the bowler-hatted men early in the 20s, and then then he stops, and then he picks it up in the 60s. And I think he's aware of his persona, and he becomes, he's kind of adopting a performative stance with the bowler hat that I see. So he experiments with collage. Mostly he experiments, there is a painting that is of a pipe, which is very thick in impasto, but mostly when he's painting illusionistically, you don't see the stroke so much. So I think he's exploring more a little bit the materials, but more the concepts and ideas and the icons, the imagery, I would say, than the materials.
I have another couple questions.
Good.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation and the richness of illusions. I have two questions and perhaps one observation. So when you showed us his self-portrait, the final self-portrait, it seems to me there was a wonderful link to the very beginning because the men in the assassination, you know, have the same kind of look, the same kind of shape. So why don't you go a step further and relate him to the detective, relate him to the criminal, relate the painting to this issue of criminality? I think there is more to say. You know, it's not a self-portrait because the photo you showed us, looks very different. So that he gives himself the shape of his former paintings should be perhaps mentioned. Then I think thinking about meta painting is interesting, but I don't know if there is any artist who is not a meta painter. That's a kind of, interesting, but I think a concept which is informing art and production. And in your thinking, as if I look back, you use a lot of interesting terms that he experiments with collages, with simulacrum, with virtuality, with the uncanny double, with mythology. So these terms are all well chosen, and it seems that you yourself experiment with the theoretical issues of deconstruction, which we all, experiment with. The question is, where is the virtuality? And I think that goes back to your question. To what does he want to refer if there is no possibility to show that what is not visible? So to paint in order to demonstrate the invisible, then this is an issue. What is this invisible? What does he try so hard to present? And it seems to me here the criminality of this whole act of painting and exposing the naked woman and playing with this sexual appeal, that might be something to explore.
Okay. I don't see him as a criminal, but I see he adopts this generic figure that becomes, that you see this in the 20s. So this is closer in time. But in structuring the book, I decided to put I thought he does some self-portraits. This is one of several. And I wanted to end on that note, which I think artists, many artists, it's meta painting. The difference is people were not talking about Magritte this way. There's a certain narrative that he's a dream painter. He's maybe they say things about the uncanny, and I wanted to bring in post-structuralist theory and specifically Deleuze and Guattari, because I think Derrida has written about Magritte, looking at different images, but it's really, he is working conceptually and working on our perceptions, what is invisible, and to make you think about, when you leave an exhibition by Magritte, you start to see reality differently. You may not take, you don't take things for granted. And if that happens, then he's worked his magic.
Just a quick question about this one that you have up. In fact, you place this in the context of the tradition of the painting, about painting or seeing the painter at work. But this is also about the same time that Metropolis came out. It almost looks like a cyborg figure, because to me, her view on her gaze is a little bit blank on the left, especially compared, say, to the right, where she clearly is looking at him there. I don't quite see that she's looking at the painter there. It's almost like he's bringing a three-dimensional being into being, like the figure in Metropolis. I wonder if he was influenced by the film in that way, and that idea, and robots and this sort of thing.
Probably, I think so. And I mean, Fantomas, watch it. I think that was the filmmaker that really inspired him. And I know it's hard to see, but her gaze, because it looks impassive, but if you drew a line, she is looking at him. And I think the thing is the reality effect of a photograph. It looks, because it's indexical, right? So this looks like she's really looking at him. But she also has just the tilt of her head is slightly, she looks more human and here it looks much more unnaturalistic.
This isn't really a question, but more of an observation. I've not seen the assassin painting before, but I did love how it created sort of a dream idea, because the shadows in the foreground are so deliberate, whereas the shadow in the daybed, for instance, is not in the same direction. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting.
Correct, right. Well, the more you look at it, the more subtle inconsistencies that you see.
Lisa, you mentioned about the influence of photography and performance on a number of these paintings. Did that also carry through with his paintings of objects and the actual objects, or mostly with the figurative work?
It did carry through with objects. So Paul Nouget did a series of photographs with some of the Belgians posed, looking at things that like a piece of string on the table and looking like afraid of it. So these kind of strange juxtapositions, and they had text. And Magritte certainly experimented with photographs and posing, but I think he usually his paintings were based on something he would have seen on his model, and I think photography was part of his work, and it's something I think I'd like to explore further. There's a book on about his photography that's much more descriptive. It's like, here's where he was when he took this photograph. He played around with it. But it informs his work. But I think especially, let's look at the later, with Brotars, when Brotars came along, they were mutually influencing each other. And what's interesting is Brotars said that Magritte created pop art. Magritte was a precursor to pop art, and Magritte didn't think so. He didn't see any connection. But they start exchanging ideas, and I found the discovery of this photograph, which fit into what I was saying, by virtue of him being literally between his two paintings, and he's performing this this photograph, lighting the match, and whereas here they're goofing off. Any other questions?
Okay, we'll take one more.
One more.
This might be obliquely related to Dorothy's question about the assassin painting. Can you just go back to it for a second? So I haven't looked at this painting for a while, but I've always found the face of the nude body, the severed head, to be quite ambiguous in terms of gender. And then on the chair is a set of this clothing, right?
Right, it's an overcoat and a fedora.
Right, so
and there's a suitcase.
That's right. So those are objects that are associated with men, bourgeois men, right? So presumably we're led to think that perhaps those clothing, the suitcase, belong to the nude figure there, which would have suggested that this person would have been dressed as a man, right? Holding that suitcase, which is my question: who is the man in the bowler hat? Because obviously the bowler hat is important for Magritte, and he plays with this. And there's something about that is a bit like a costume, right? And inside the man in the bowler hat, who is it?
But this is actually not a bowler hat. Do you
It's
mean
a
the
fedora,
man?
yeah.
Right.
It's a provocative question. There's something strange about this, right? So this nude would have been dressed in that, right? At least we're led to think.
Why do you think this is her clothing? Because I've always thought it was his. So it's an overcoat with a hat.
I've always thought it was the man's.
Right. So it's a provocative idea that if we think of this as but then what happened to the rest of her clothing?
I'm open to the
Or
idea
his
that it
clothing.
was hers.
We'll talk later.
Is there anything in any of his work that would indicate that? What she's alluding to?
Right. No. There is a painting, painting he did called Le Viol, which means rape, translates as rape. That's a woman's face with the eyes are breasts, the pubic hair is the mouth. And that was a provocative image that André Breton used to illustrate what is surrealism, a surrealist publication. So he did much more lurid works, and I mentioned Le Viol. I don't analyze that specifically. So there's nothing else. I don't know. I'd have to think about that and look at other things. I don't see Magritte as exploring gender in that way, as some of the other surrealists. As this scene where the description that I read talks about the minimal underclothing, and this is clearly outerwear. So I think he's looking at what Nouget wrote and painting it, but not to be an illustration, but bringing this idea into painting.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. I'll be around if you want to talk more Magritte.